I still remember the day I signed the papers for my little slice of heaven outside the HOA. No restrictions, no neighbors policing my mailbox. No, your grass is too tall letters that smell faintly of passive aggression. Just me, the open sky, and acres of freedom. Honestly, it felt like winning the lottery, except instead of money, I got land and the right to live without a committee telling me how to live. The first time I drove onto the property, I almost cried. It was early morning, the sun just brushing the tops of the trees, casting a golden glow over everything. The grass waved in the wind like it was cheering me on, birds were singing, squirrels were, well, squirrels being squirrels, and me, I was grinning like an idiot, imagining all the things I could do: build a cabin, plant a ridiculous number of sunflowers, maybe even put a tiny pond in the back and call it my mini Lake Tahoe. Freedom, I thought, tastes like dirt and morning air. Of course, freedom comes with a little work. I spent the next few days walking the property, making mental notes. This is where the fire pit goes, that's the perfect spot for the garden, and over there, that's the hill I can run up while pretending I'm in a dramatic movie montage. I was basically a kid in a sandbox, except the sandbox was 10 acres and no one was going to yell at me for digging holes. And then, just when I was starting to plan my first backyard barbecue, it happened. I opened my email to see a subject line that made my blood run cold. Notice of violation, immediate action required. I laughed, really, I did. This must be a mistake, I muttered. Maybe someone got confused, maybe it was spam, but curiosity got the better of me, I clicked. And there it was, a letter from the HOA. Not one of the HOA from across the county, mind you, this was the HOA from the neighborhood 2 miles down the road, the neighborhood I hadn't joined, the neighborhood I had deliberately moved away from. They claimed my property violated community standards and demanded I either comply or face further action. At first, I thought it was a joke. My property wasn't even inside the HOA boundaries. I double-checked my deed. Yep, clear as day, my land was mine, freedom was mine. And yet somehow I had managed to attract the attention of a group of people whose entire life mission seemed to be telling others what to do. I called the HOA office, trying to keep my voice calm. "Hi, I think you have the wrong property," I said, keeping a smile in my tone, though I could feel it slipping into disbelief. "I don't even live in your neighborhood." The person on the other end, a woman with a voice that could freeze water, said, "Sir, it has come to our attention that your property is causing concern among our members." Concern, the word echoed in my head. Concern for what? My mailbox, my grass, my perfectly legal fire pit. I hung up and stared at the ceiling. This had to be a mistake. I thought about laughing it off. Maybe they'd get bored, send a polite apology, and that would be the end of it. But deep down, a tiny voice, let's call it intuition, whispered, "Oh no, this isn't going to end politely." A few days later, I went back to the property, imagining my little retreat, and there it was. At the edge of the tree line, barely visible from the road, a flash of yellow and steel. My stomach sank. I squinted. Bulldozers, big, angry-looking bulldozers rolling toward my land. My first thought, they must be mistaken, surely this can't be happening. My second thought, okay, maybe this is a nightmare. My third thought, as I watched them inch closer, oh, they are definitely coming for me. I froze, I didn't want to believe it. But the rumble of those machines and the sight of men in reflective vests moving with purpose made it impossible to deny. My land, my freedom, my dream, was suddenly under siege by a group of people who apparently had nothing better to do than send bulldozers after someone who wasn't even in their neighborhood. I ran back to my truck, heart hammering, palms sweaty. I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't just going to sit there and watch them destroy my property. No way, not without a fight. I pulled out my phone and dialed the sheriff's office. My voice shook not from fear but from adrenaline. "Hello, yes, you might want to come see this." As I hung up, I could see the bulldozers moving closer and I realized this wasn't just a battle over property. This was going to be a war. And the HOA, they had no idea what was coming. I didn't have much time to panic. The bulldozers were inching closer, and somewhere in my brain, the phrase, "this can't be legal," kept repeating itself like a broken record. But I had a secret weapon, my phone, and the person on the other end of that line, the sheriff. "Sheriff's office, how can I help you?" A calm voice answered, and I immediately tried to sound rational, which, let's be honest, is always tricky when you're standing on your property, watching 2 tons of steel slowly roll toward your newly planted saplings. "Yes, hi," I said, taking a deep breath. I bought land outside an HOA, I have all the legal papers, and well, they just sent bulldozers onto my property." I paused, hoping I sounded calm, not like a man on the verge of losing his mind. There was a quiet pause, then, can you repeat that?" I repeated it slowly, clearly, and maybe a little dramatically because honestly it was dramatic. They're here, bulldozers, my land, I'm not in the HOA, and I think they're going to start leveling my property. The silence on the other end lasted about 3 heartbeats too long. Finally, the sheriff said, "All right, sir, stay where you are, we'll send someone out to check it." I hung up, and for the first time I allowed myself a nervous laugh. Okay, maybe things weren't completely hopeless, but it didn't make the sight of those enormous machines any less terrifying. I backed up my truck to a safe distance, keeping one eye on the approaching bulldozers. From a distance, they looked almost gleeful, like tiny yellow monsters coming to mess up my life. I swear one of them looked like it was smirking. Then my phone buzzed, a text from the HOA. "We noticed your property may be encroaching on HOA boundaries. Immediate compliance is required. Bulldozers on site as of 2:17 p.m. My jaw dropped. A text? They had the audacity to text me while sending bulldozers? I read it 3 times, hoping maybe I misread it. Nope, it said exactly what I thought it said. I took a deep breath, muttering under my breath, "You've got to be kidding me, this is unreal." I called the HOA again, partly to yell, partly to understand what in the world was going on. A man answered this time, and he sounded way too chipper for someone about to destroy someone's property. "Yes, sir, we're just making sure our community standards are upheld," he said. "You know, safety aesthetics." I blinked. "Aesthetics? My land isn't in your neighborhood, I don't even have a mailbox yet. What standards are you enforcing?" "Well, it's just we received reports," he stammered, "and that was it, that was the reason." Reports. Someone called, probably bored, and suddenly I was public enemy number 1 in HOA land. I hung up, shaking my head. This was absurd, but also terrifying. Because here's the thing about absurdity, it doesn't matter how funny or ridiculous it is, it's still happening right now on your land. And then I saw the sheriff's car crest the hill. Relief and hope collided in my chest. Someone in authority had arrived. I waved like a lunatic, pointing at the bulldozers like I was signaling a rescue team in a disaster movie. The deputies jumped out, assessing the situation with calm efficiency. One of them, clearly experienced in handling absurd disputes, asked, "So, let me get this straight. They sent bulldozers onto your property because you own land?" "Yes," I practically shouted. "I own land, I have the papers, they're trespassing." They nodded like they'd heard crazier things before, which I was beginning to think was entirely possible. One deputy radioed in the situation, while the other approached the bulldozer operators. I watched as the men in yellow helmets suddenly looked very small and uncertain. Apparently, facing a law enforcement officer is less fun than texting property owners who knew. As I stood there, heart still racing, I realized something. This wasn't just about my land anymore. This was about standing up to ridiculousness, about making it clear that property rights, legal, paper-stamped property rights, still mattered. And if the HOA thought they could bully me with bulldozers, they were in for a very rude awakening. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. One thing was clear, this was only the beginning, and if I thought the first contact was scary, I had no idea what they had planned next. Because when the HOA sends bulldozers, well, you can bet they'll escalate if you don't push back. By the time I made it back to the edge of my property, the sheriff's deputies had already approached the bulldozer operators. From a distance, it looked like a standoff straight out of a low-budget action movie. 2 yellow machines, engines rumbling like angry beasts, and a couple of men in hard hats looking increasingly nervous. And there I was, my heart pounding, waving my arms like some kind of desperate conductor of chaos. I couldn't help but mutter to myself, "This is insane, who even does this?" Apparently HOAs, that's who. The lead bulldozer operator, a guy in a neon vest who looked about 20 years too young to have this kind of responsibility, called over, "Us, sir, we were told to." "Stop, you can't touch anything," I shouted. "This is private property, I am calling the sheriff." He glanced at the deputies who were calmly standing a few feet away, arms crossed. The operator hesitated, looking between me and the law as if trying to decide which was scarier. Spoiler, it was definitely the law. I tried to keep my cool, but I won't lie, my mind was racing. They actually sent heavy machinery after me, on my land. On the morning I planned to relax, my dream of peaceful, HOA-free living was suddenly a full-blown reality TV drama. "Sir," the deputy finally said, stepping forward, "I need you to step back for your safety. Let's handle this professionally." Professional, right? Because nothing says professionalism like an HOA that thinks bulldozers are a valid form of communication. I backed up, hands raised, trying not to look like I was hyperventilating. "Look, I don't want trouble," I said, trying to inject calm into my voice. I just own the land, they're trespassing, they can't do this. The deputy nodded, clearly used to absurd calls. We'll make sure they don't do anything, you need to stay calm. Calm, easier said than done when two giant machines are staring at you like predators who just smelled fear. Then it happened. One of the operators tapped his helmet and muttered something to the other, and suddenly it was like watching toddlers in a sandbox realizing the adult is actually serious. The bulldozers didn't move, not a centimeter, and I could see the sweat forming on the young man's forehead. It was almost satisfying, almost. I laughed nervously. You see, they're scared now, even the machines are scared. The HOA naturally was not going to let this end quietly. From the edge of my property, I could see a small car creeping down the road, their president, all self-righteousness and pearl-clutching, stepping out like she owned the world. She had a clipboard, sunglasses, and the kind of scowl that could intimidate a bear, or at least a homeowner like me. She stomped toward me, arms crossed, muttering loudly about community standards and immediate action. My heart sank. I had survived the bulldozer moment, but now came the human storm. Sir, she barked, voice carrying over the rumble of engines. You are in violation. These machines are here because you refuse to comply. I tried to keep my tone calm but firm. Excuse me, I am outside the HOA, your rules don't apply to me, and you do not have the right to send bulldozers onto private property. She huffed, flipping through papers like they were weapons. Our members are concerned. This is a matter of community integrity. Community integrity? I stared at her, blinked, and almost laughed out loud. Integrity? You send bulldozers to a man who legally owns his land. The sheriff's deputy stepped between us. Ma'am, you need to leave the property immediately. This is trespassing. Her eyes widened, like she had just realized she was dealing with actual authority instead of a scared little homeowner she could intimidate with passive-aggressive letters. For a moment, everything froze. The machines, the humans, even the birds in the trees seemed to hold their breath. Then slowly the bulldozer operators began to back up, engines quieted, and I, for the first time in hours, felt a surge of hope. But I wasn't naive. I knew this wasn't over. HOAs don't give up easily. They find ways to strike back. Fines, lawsuits, ridiculous rules that somehow always seem to apply to you. Still, I allowed myself a small grin. I had stood my ground. My land was safe for now. And as I watched her storm back to her car, muttering threats and promises, I realized something crucial. This battle had just begun. Because if she thought sending bulldozers would scare me, she had another thing coming. After the bulldozer standoff, I thought I might finally be able to breathe. But let me tell you, nothing in my life had prepared me for the next few hours. I had barely started to pat myself on the back when the reality hit me. HOAs don't quit, they escalate. And apparently their next move was whatever they could think of next. I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't just going to sit around waiting for another concerned member to call in a fleet of yellow machines. No, this needed a little help from someone who actually understood the law. Enter the sheriff. I grabbed my phone and dialed the non-emergency line, trying to sound calm, professional, and like I wasn't about to burst into tears from adrenaline. Hello, yes, this is regarding an HOA trespassing on my property, I said, carefully choosing my words. Yes, they've already sent bulldozers. No, I'm not exaggerating. Please, someone come now. The dispatcher chuckled lightly on the other end. I swear I could hear the smirk through the phone. Sir, calm down. We get calls like this more often than you think. Officers are on the way. Just stay on your property and don't engage. Calm down, right? Sure. Easy advice when the threat of mechanical destruction is inching closer by the minute. I paced. I tried to think strategically. What would a person in a movie do? Maybe hide behind a tree and deliver a witty monologue, or wave a flag signaling surrender while secretly plotting revenge. I opted for packing, lots of packing. Minutes later, I saw the sheriff's SUV crest the hill. Relief hit me like a ton of bricks. I waved my arms like a maniac again, but this time with a slightly more coordinated rhythm. The deputies jumped out, professionalism written all over their faces. One of them, a tall guy with sunglasses, looked at me and shook his head. Let me guess, HOA problem. You have no idea, I muttered, pointing back at the far edge of my property where the bulldozers had stopped, engines idling but ready to pounce. The deputies approached the machines, calmly assessing the operators. Meanwhile, I got my first real look at the HOA president from earlier. She was back in her car, packing, phone glued to her ear like she was trying to summon reinforcements or maybe record my destruction for posterity. One deputy turned to me. Sir, do you have documentation proving this is your land? I waved my deed around like a knight holding a sword. Of course, legal, official, stamped, notarized, and please, someone stop her from sending more machines. The deputy nodded. We'll handle that, just stay back and let us do our job. I did as I was told mostly. My mind raced. They came prepared, but so am I. I began thinking about my next moves. Social media, photos of the bulldozers, a cheeky post about the HOA trying to demolish a legally owned property, maybe even a funny live stream titled HOA versus Freedom, the Battle of the Century. But then one of the deputies called me over. Sir, the operators say they're just following orders. If they move a blade, it's considered trespassing. Legally, they're stopped, but you might want to document this. Document? Right. I started snapping photos like a tourist who had stumbled onto a construction-themed horror movie. The operators looked nervously at their machines, the president glared from her car, and I felt a little victorious. Then came the subtle reminder of the stakes. The HOA president got out of her car again, marching toward us with the determination of someone who believes rules and clipboards can bend reality. She started shouting about community integrity and immediate consequences. The deputy held up a hand. Ma'am, you are not authorized to be on this property, you need to leave. Her jaw dropped, she blinked, and I swear she had the exact moment of realization that she wasn't in charge here. I almost felt bad, almost. I realized something in that moment. This wasn't just about stopping the bulldozers. It wasn't just about keeping my land intact. This was about setting a precedent. If I gave in now, HOAs everywhere would see that they could intimidate, threaten, and send machinery at innocent property owners without consequence. And I wasn't about to let that happen. So I stood my ground, hands on hips, trying to look casual while my heart raced like a jackhammer. The deputies made sure the president left the property. The bulldozer operators finally shut down their machines, shaking their heads, probably questioning their life choices. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my adrenaline. Victory? Maybe. But I knew this wasn't over. HOAs love paperwork, bureaucracy, and persistence. And somewhere, someone was already drafting the next move. I glanced around at my property, safe for now, but still buzzing with tension. One thing was certain, if they thought this was the end of it, they were sorely mistaken. Because in the battle between me and the HOA, I was just getting started. I thought the bulldozer debacle was the peak of absurdity. Oh, how naive I was. A few days later, the HOA president called me. Not a text, not a passive-aggressive email, but a full-blown, let's come to your property and harass you in person kind of call. I knew from the tone that this wasn't going to be polite small talk. No, this was a prelude to a showdown. Sir, she said when I answered, voice icy and clipped, I believe we need to discuss your property and its community impact. I'll be there shortly. I pinched the bridge of my nose and muttered, oh, this is going to be fun. Fun, of course, is a relative term. In my book, fun didn't involve a woman in designer sunglasses striding across your land like she was auditioning for Law and Order, HOA edition. She arrived in her little black sedan, clipboard in hand, heels clicking like a metronome counting down my patience. I watched from the porch of my half-built cabin. Okay, fine, a clearing with a fire pit, but still this was my land, and she had crossed onto it without permission. Sir, she barked the moment she stepped out of the car, your property is a blatant violation of community standards. You are. I held up a hand, cutting her off mid-rant. Excuse me, ma'am, I am not in the HOA. I legally own this land. Your rules don't apply to me, and technically you're trespassing right now. Her lips tightened, but she didn't back down. That may be what your deed says, but we have obligations. Obligations? I could feel the sarcasm building in my chest. Obligations to what? Make sure everyone's mailbox is exactly 32 inches from the curb. She ignored the jab. I could see her muttering under her breath, flipping through papers as though reading the rules aloud would magically bend reality. The deputies had been called again as a precaution. They stayed a few steps behind, giving her enough rope to hang herself, metaphorically speaking. I couldn't help but smirk. The HOA thinks they can intimidate me with clipboards and pretense, but here the law had my back. You are endangering property values, she shouted. Your land, your so-called private land, is a threat to community aesthetics. I laughed, loud, incredulous, slightly hysterical laughter. Community aesthetics, lady, the closest neighbor is 2 miles away. The only thing at risk here is your ego. She opened her mouth to retort, then paused. She was calculating, probably thinking of some fancy legalese to throw at me, but I had one secret weapon she didn't anticipate: documentation. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, sliding it across the hood of my truck. Photos, videos, timestamps, every warning, every ridiculous email, every ridiculous text about bulldozers en route. Evidence, cold and undeniable. The deputies nodded approvingly. I could tell they were enjoying this as much as I was. She, on the other hand, looked like someone just handed her a cactus and asked her to hug it. You can't prove anything," she sputtered. I smiled, calm and almost too relaxed. Actually, I can, and I just did. There was a tense pause. I could almost hear her brain working overtime, trying to think of another way to intimidate me, but every bluff I could see crumbling in real time. Finally, one of the deputies stepped forward. "Ma'am, you've been warned. This is your last notice to leave the property immediately." Her face went pale, but she straightened her back, probably trying to look authoritative. She muttered something about consulting with legal counsel and stomped back to her car. I exhaled a long, shaky breath. Victory, maybe, but this was more than just a win, it was a message. You don't send bulldozers onto someone's land, you don't threaten them, and if you do, there are consequences. As her car disappeared down the road, I looked around at my land, at the fire pit, the saplings, the open skis. Freedom tasted sweeter than ever. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. HOAs love persistence almost as much as they love rules. They'll find new ways to test me, to try and poke holes in my little victory. Still, for today, I had won. And that was worth celebrating. After the face-to-face showdown, I thought I could finally take a deep breath, maybe even make a cup of coffee and enjoy my little slice of peace. That would have been too easy. The HOA president wasn't done. No, apparently sending bulldozers and showing up uninvited wasn't enough. I started noticing new communications in my mailbox, letters stamped with big, official-looking HOA seals demanding I comply, pay fines, or face further action. Each envelope made me laugh and groan at the same time. It was like a bad sitcom where I was the unwilling star. But this time I was ready. The sheriff had made it very clear, if anything else happened, I was to call immediately, and I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. It started subtly. One morning, as I was walking the property, I noticed a white truck slowly cruising past my driveway. No markings, no company name, just a truck and two men staring a little too hard at my property. My first instinct was to hide behind a tree and pretend to be invisible. My second instinct was more reasonable, call the sheriff. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking slightly, not from fear exactly, but from adrenaline and the sheer ridiculousness of the situation. "Sheriff's office?" I said. "Yes, I think we might have another HOA situation. Nothing's been damaged yet, but I think they're trying to intimidate me." The dispatcher calmly reassured me that deputies would be dispatched immediately. And this time, they didn't just send one patrol car, they sent two, with the backup SUV following close behind. When the deputies arrived, I explained the situation, pointing out the suspicious truck still parked across the road, the men inside looking like they were auditioning for a spy movie. The deputies nodded, professionalism written all over their faces. One of them chuckled slightly. "You know, we get calls like this all the time, people thinking the HOA is a secret army, but your situation is pretty impressive." Impressive, I had to laugh. "Yeah, tell me about it. Bulldozers, letters, uninvited visits. I didn't even know HOA drama could be this cinematic." The deputies approached the truck, carefully and methodically like it was a crime scene. The men inside finally noticed and tried to act casual, but the law has a way of making people nervous, even if they think they're following some imaginary rulebook. After a brief inspection, it became clear the men had been hired by the HOA. Their mission? Intimidation, no legal grounds, no actual authority, just a creepy attempt to make me back down. The deputies escorted the men off the property and issued a stern warning. "Trespassing is a crime," one said, "do not return." I felt a mix of relief and smug satisfaction. I could practically hear the HOA president chewing her nails from miles away, and in that moment I realized just how powerful it was to have actual authority on my side. Later, as I walked the property, I reflected on what had happened. The sheriff's intervention wasn't just about stopping the HOA's immediate threats, it was a signal. A reminder that even the most overzealous, rule-obsessed association cannot trample on actual property rights without consequences. I made a mental note to document everything from now on. Photos, videos, timestamps, even the weird looks from passing trucks. Evidence, I realized, was my secret weapon. Because the next time the HOA tried something, I wanted to be ready, not just to defend my property, but to defend my sanity. And then, of course, came the inevitable call from the HOA president herself. Her voice was tense this time, a mixture of indignation and disbelief. You called the sheriff again?" she demanded. "Yes," I said calmly, feeling a little like a superhero with the law as my sidekick. "Because your representatives were trespassing, and if you think I'm going to tolerate bulldozers and intimidation, you're sorely mistaken." There was a long pause. I could almost hear her plotting, her mind running through every possible petty tactic she could use next. But at that moment, the power had shifted. I wasn't the overwhelmed property owner anymore. I was the one standing firm with law enforcement on my side. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to savor it. Freedom, my land, the sheriff's intervention. I even laughed a little, imagining her packing in her office, furious that her little army of intimidation had been turned back by a few deputies and a property deed. But deep down, I knew the HOA wouldn't give up. Not yet. They were persistent, they were bureaucratic, and they were about to realize that I was just as stubborn as they were. Because if they thought a few threats and a couple of unmarked trucks would make me back down, they had another thing coming. After the sheriff had officially stepped in, I felt a surge of confidence. But I knew better than to relax completely. HOAs don't just roll over when you push back, they escalate in ways you can't always predict. And trust me, they love paperwork as much as they love passive-aggressive letters. I spent the next few days strategizing. I couldn't rely on law enforcement alone. The HOA had money, influence, and apparently a strange fascination with bulldozers. I had, well, me, a clear deed and a willingness to fight smart. First, I documented everything. Emails, letters, texts, photos of the bulldozers, videos of the trespassing attempts, timestamps of every call and interaction. By the time I was done, I had a full portfolio that could make any attorney proud, or at least mildly entertained. Then came the fun part, social proof. I started telling neighbors, well, the ones who actually existed miles away, about the ridiculousness of the HOA's actions. A few were amused, some were horrified, and one guy even offered to help monitor the property in case the HOA tried another stunt. I'd gained allies, however small, and it felt like assembling a tiny but loyal army. Next, I decided to play the HOA at their own game. If they loved rules, regulations, and bureaucracy, I'd give them rules, regulations, and bureaucracy, but on my terms. I sent them a certified letter politely outlining the legal boundaries of my property, the trespassing incidents, and the fact that any future unauthorized activity would be documented and reported. I even attached copies of my deed and photographs. I could practically hear them grinding their teeth from miles away. Then came my favorite move, subtle public exposure. I posted a few pictures online, nothing offensive, just a humorous documentation of HOA versus Freedom Day 3. The bulldozers were in the frame, along with the deputies who had calmly stopped them. I captioned it lightly, "Some people like flowers, some people like bulldozers on their neighbor's land. Guess which side I'm on." The reaction was instantaneous. Friends, family, and even a few strangers chimed in with support, disbelief, and most importantly, validation. Nothing engenders an overzealous HOA more than public scrutiny. Meanwhile, the HOA president started dialing my phone repeatedly. I let it ring. Let her leave messages. Each one sounded more frantic than the last. I could hear the desperation in her voice over the voicemail. "This is your final warning. Compliance is mandatory." I almost laughed out loud. Almost. The beauty of this countermove was that I wasn't just defending myself, I was setting the rules of engagement. They thought they could intimidate me with bulldozers, threats, and letters. I turned the tables with logic, law, and a little humor. And it worked. Slowly, I could sense the HOA losing control. The next escalation attempt they tried, sending a surveyor to measure encroachment, was quickly thwarted by the deputies who reminded the surveyor that trespassing is illegal. Another small victory, but an important one. Momentum was on my side. I spent the evening on my property, watching the sunset over my little piece of freedom, feeling a mix of pride and relief. The land was safe, the bulldozers were gone, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had regained control. But even as I smiled, I knew this wasn't the end. HOAs are nothing if not persistent, and somewhere she was probably planning the next ridiculous move. The difference now, I was ready. I had evidence, allies, law enforcement support, and the satisfaction of knowing that every attempt to intimidate me had failed. And that feeling sweet, victorious, defiant was mine. I leaned against the hood of my truck, watching the wind ripple through the grass, and muttered to myself, "Try it again, HOA, I dare you." Because I wasn't just defending property anymore. I was standing up to absurdity, bureaucracy, and the kind of overreach that makes people's blood boil. And I was doing it with a smile, a camera, and a well-documented plan. The HOA thought they could bully me into submission. They were about to learn that when you mess with the wrong landowner, the results can be unexpectedly entertaining. And for the first time in this battle, I felt like I was not just surviving, it was starting to feel like a victory. The weeks of chaos, threats, and surreal HOA antics had taken a toll, but finally it was time for the grand finale. By now I had become somewhat of a local legend. Friends and neighbors followed my updates, laughing at the absurdity of bulldozers sent against a man who legally owned his land. Even strangers online were cheering me on. I realized that sometimes the best weapon against bureaucracy is sheer persistence and a little public embarrassment. The HOA president, of course, was not thrilled with her new fame. Her calls had become frantic, her letters increasingly desperate, and her last email was basically a novella of indignation. But no matter how she tried, the law, documentation, and my clever countermoves had put me firmly in control. That day, I decided to make a symbolic gesture. I walked across my property holding a small American flag I had bought on a whim, not as a political statement but as a personal one. This was my land, my freedom, my victory. And then I noticed it, a car slowly rolling down the hill. My heart sank for a split second, but the silhouette behind the wheel gave me pause. It wasn't a bulldozer, it wasn't a surveyor. It was her, the HOA president. I braced myself. Part of me expected more shouting, more threats, maybe even a dramatic attempt at intimidation. But instead, she rolled to a stop, stepped out, and astonishingly held up her hands. I suppose you win, she said, her voice tight. I can see that you are legally correct, and the sheriff is clearly on your side. We will leave you alone. I stared at her, blinking. The words were almost unbelievable. After weeks of chaos, this was the first hint of surrender. I allowed myself a small, victorious smile. Thank you, I said, keeping my tone calm but triumphant. I'm glad we could resolve this without more bulldozers. Her face flushed slightly. I could practically see the gears turning in her head, probably wondering how she had gone from confident HOA overlord to defeated visitor on someone else's land. I knew better than to gloat too much. Instead, I extended a hand. We're good, I asked. She hesitated, then shook it stiffly. Yes, good. And just like that, the HOA's reign of terror ended, for now at least. The sheriff deputies, who had been quietly observing from a respectful distance, nodded at me. One of them said with a grin, nicely handled, You stood your ground and you had all your ducks in a row. That's how it's done. I chuckled, feeling a mix of relief and pride. Standing there on my land, surrounded by trees, open sky, and the faint sound of birdsong, I realized something important. This battle wasn't just about property. It was about asserting your rights, standing up to nonsense, and refusing to be intimidated by people who think rules apply only when convenient. I took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. The bulldozers were gone, the HOA was defeated, at least in this round, and my land, my dream, was safe. To celebrate, I decided to throw a little victory barbecue. I invited the neighbors, well, the ones who lived nearby, and even the deputies who had helped me keep the peace. There were burgers, laughter, and a ridiculous amount of grilled corn. I raised my soda can in a toast. To freedom, I said, to landowners who refuse to be bullied, and to the absurdity of HOAs everywhere, may they always be kept in check. Everyone laughed, clinking cans, and for the first time in weeks, I felt completely at ease. The tension, the fear, the uncertainty, they were all gone. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across my little paradise, I knew one thing. I had fought hard, stayed smart, and refused to let ridiculousness dictate my life. The HOA had tried to scare me. They had sent bulldozers, unmarked trucks, and a flurry of threatening letters. But in the end, persistence, preparation, and a little humor had won the day. I looked around at my land, at the laughter and smiles of friends, and whispered to myself, This is mine, all mine, and no HOA, no matter how self-righteous, will ever take that away. And with that, I finally felt free, truly free. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.